Something profound happens when you truly understand that you no longer fear being alone. There's a silent shift in your soul, as if a part of you is preparing for an internal revolution. He came to you with eyes filled with fear. He, who had already felt a deep connection, now seemed lost and vulnerable. There was something there, something in the words he brought. He said he was afraid of losing you, and upon hearing this you realized something. He wasn't just referring to love or the relationship, but to your very presence. He feared losing the only person who made him feel whole, but what he didn't know was that you had already begun to reconnect with your own completeness, without depending on anyone else to feel complete. His fear of losing you is a direct reflection of what he has yet to understand about his own life. He doesn't recognize that your courage, the one you built slowly and quietly, arose from the acceptance of loneliness as a companion. You began to see that loneliness wasn't a monster, but a quiet ally that taught you the power of being whole, of being enough, even in the most solitary moments. And he, not realizing this, projected his fear of being left in emptiness, but what he didn't know was that your emptiness had already been filled. Completely. You no longer feared abandonment. When he whispered that he was afraid of losing you, you responded with a profound silence, maintaining your calm. There was nothing more to say. Your message was clear. You were no longer afraid of being alone. He did not know, but in that moment you were freeing him. You were freeing him from the expectation that you needed him to feel whole. In a way, you were also starting to liberate him from his own fear, the fear that made him believe he depended on you for happiness, for completeness. His freedom could only be attained when he accepted his own emptiness and his ability to fill it by himself. But what he did not understand was that you had already faced and overcome your own fear of loneliness, and this gave you a strength he could never have imagined. It wasn't that you didn't love him, but what became clear to you at that moment was that your peace did not depend on him. This realization changes everything. It alters the power dynamics, the way the two of you relate to each other, and more importantly, how you view yourself in relation to him and to life itself. He feared losing you, but did you fear losing yourself? No, not anymore. And that in itself transformed the relationship between you. The power was in your hands now, for you had already achieved the most important thing, your own soul. By understanding this, your courage grew. When you no longer fear loneliness, when you no longer see yourself as a hostage to the need for company, you become immune to emotional manipulation, those attempts to sway your heart with empty promises or with others' fears. This was the power that he unknowingly was beginning to feel. But would he understand? Would he be able to perceive the depth of your transformation? That was yet to come. When you start to realize that true loneliness is not a punishment, but an invitation, your life changes. This perception often catches people by surprise. He probably never knew how strong you had become by keeping your own company. It wasn't a quick process, but a quiet journey, shaped by each moment you found yourself alone, and each empty space you needed to fill with your own presence. It was in this place of solitude that you discovered the strength he never imagined existed within you. As he shared his fears, you noticed his dependence on you. He feared losing you, but not because he truly understood how much you meant to him. He was afraid of losing you because, in reality, he didn't know how to live without you. He was still trapped in the idea that loneliness was a threat. Perhaps he had never allowed himself to be truly alone. Maybe he hadn't discovered within himself what you had bravely found, the ability to be enough on your own. Loneliness is not just about being alone. It's not merely the absence of someone else by your side. In fact, it's about being complete with yourself, without needing external validation, without depending on others to affirm your worth. When you realize this, you begin to make choices driven by your own inner strength, no longer by the need to please, to be accepted, or to avoid being alone. He, on the contrary, still found himself fearing that loneliness was the answer to everything he dreaded. When you told him you no longer feared being alone, you were saying that you had found your own peace in your own company. And that was a shock to him. How could anyone free themselves from something so seemingly frightening? How could you, without hesitation, say that you no longer feared loneliness? He had never realized that this fear of being alone was not, in fact, a genuine fear. It was merely a reflection of his inability to connect with himself in a true way. And the impact of this on your relationship was immediate. The balance of power shifted, not in the sense of conscious control, but in a subtle transformation where you became more centered, more calm, more serene. He, on the other hand, became more aware of his emotional dependency. He might have felt a growing insecurity, a need to reaffirm his place in your life, but he didn't know you had already decided that your place was, first and foremost, by your own side. This was not a matter of distancing yourself, but of perception. You were no longer available to be used as an emotional escape valve. You were no longer willing to sacrifice your inner peace to maintain the balance of someone who could not balance themselves on their own. You understood that true love does not require this kind of dependency. True love is one that arises from respect for oneself and for the other, one that does not demand sacrifices, but rather union in freedom. When he says he's afraid of losing you, you understand that deep down he's actually afraid of losing the last person who could bring him closer to his own truth. And you realize that he's not looking for love, but for reassurance. He seeks the guarantee that he doesn't have to face his own emptiness. And when you make it clear through your silence and calm response that you're no longer afraid of being alone, you are, inadvertently, giving him the greatest gift he can receive, the truth that he also needs to learn to be whole by himself. In the days that followed, what happened was something unexpected. It was no longer about arguments or disputes. It wasn't about you being cold or distant. On the contrary, you were more present than ever, but now a free presence. You no longer lived in fear of abandonment, nor were you willing to be anyone's savior. You found yourself becoming more whole each day, and in some way he began to notice. Slowly his fear transformed into a new understanding of the dynamics between you. He was starting to grasp, even if vaguely, that your freedom didn't threaten love, it actually strengthened it. And paradoxically, as you distanced yourself from a desperate need to belong, he felt the absence of something in his life that he didn't even know he had lost. When you become someone who no longer fears solitude, you become invincible. This doesn't mean you abandon the relationships you love. It means you approach them from a place of security, without neediness, free from the weight of the fear that something might break. He still hadn't comprehended the depth of what had happened. He couldn't yet see that his emotional dependency and insecurities were being challenged at every moment. When you said you no longer feared solitude, he didn't understand what that represented. He thought that in some way it meant withdrawal, that you would distance yourself from him. But what he didn't know was that your response was actually drawing him back, not out of necessity, but by the strength of your transformation. Over time, he realized that the absence of the fear of being alone within you created a different kind of tension in the relationship. It wasn't a tension of withdrawal, but of liberation. The fear of losing him, which had dominated him, began to give way to something healthier. Your love was no longer based on the need for rescue. It was no longer a game of emotional dependency. It was no longer a field where he could place his insecurities and expect you to fill the gaps. Now the relationship was becoming a space of mutual choices and respect for each other's freedom, and most importantly, a relationship based on love that honors individuality, where there is no longer any emotional blackmail because both respect each other as whole beings, not as missing pieces. When you freed yourself from the fear of being alone, you actually liberated yourself from the fear of being manipulated. No matter what happened, you already knew. You would no longer be held hostage by the insecurity of another, no longer a hostage to expectations, empty promises, or the emotional pressure that tries to trap both of you in a game of control. And this, in fact, was the key to completely transforming the dynamics between you two. He realized that by no longer allowing himself to be controlled by the fear of loneliness, you were freer to love him fully, not out of need, but by choice. This, in the end, was what he needed to recognize for the relationship to become genuine, without manipulations, without fears, and without the shadows of emotional blackmail that threaten so many connections. And finally, you find yourself before him, not as the solution to his fears, but as a reflection of the strength he can eventually achieve. And now, as he confronts his own fears, you find yourself more whole than ever. Did you know that true freedom isn't just about distancing yourself from external dependencies, but also about realizing that you don't need validation to simply be? Emotional autonomy isn't a state of indifference, but rather a full connection with your own essence. It arises when you allow yourself to live without the constraints of need, when you can look within and see that everything you truly need is already inside you. And it was this awakening that later made him realize the depth of what was happening between the two of you. When he came to you with his fear of losing you, you understood what he was saying, but at the same time, you also understood what he still didn't see. He was afraid of losing the dependence he had cultivated, not just on you, but on the idea that you were the only one who could make him whole. He never realized that he, just like you, had the potential to be complete on his own. And that was his pain. A pain he still didn't know how to transform into wisdom, but you already knew. You knew that true strength doesn't lie in the power that someone else has over you, but in the knowledge that no one can control your emotional destiny except you. When he said he feared losing you, you realized that it wasn't you he was losing, but the illusion that he needed you to feel valid. What you discovered in that moment was that it was no longer possible to be manipulated, not by him, not by anyone. Your freedom lay in not depending on the approval of anyone to exist. This new place you occupied was transformative. He began to notice that even without the pressure of emotional dependency, the relationship between you was becoming stronger, more genuine, because now there was space for love without fear, for love that is free. Without this constant need for validation, the love that remained was authentic, like a flame that burns more brightly when there's nothing left to dim its light. When you no longer need the other person's presence to feel valid, when you see yourself as enough in your own company, the relationship stops being a battleground of emotional struggles and becomes fertile ground for mutual growth. The most surprising thing for him was to realize that the more you surrendered to this emotional freedom, the more he found himself drawn to your energy. He was still trapped by his own fears and insecurities, but something was different now. He could no longer manipulate you, not for lack of trying, but because you had broken the invisible chain that linked him to your fear. He didn't know it, but you had already freed him, and in doing so you also freed yourself. Now when he expressed his fears, you no longer reacted with the urgency to calm him or to fill the empty spaces in his heart. You simply listened to him, not with pity or a desire to rescue him, but with empathy. You understood that he needed to face his own shadows, that only he could walk the path of emotional healing. And by allowing him to confront this without your constant interference, you were, in fact, offering the greatest gift you could give him, the opportunity to mature, grow, and realize that he didn't need you to be happy. You were no longer there to fill him or save him. You were there to be an authentic presence, free and whole within yourself, and this completely changed the dynamic. He was no longer the center of your life as he used to be, yet at the same time you continued to love him in a deeper and more real way. That kind of love that doesn't require control, that doesn't seek to heal the wounds of another, but offers itself as a shared, full, and conscious experience. The greatest lesson you learned by freeing yourself from the fear of being alone was realizing that love is not a bargain. Love is not about what you gain or lose, but about what you share. When you stopped seeing loneliness as a burden and transformed it into a space for personal growth, you not only liberated yourself but also freed those around you. He may never have immediately understood the impact of this, but you realized your absence of fear was the greatest step toward true freedom, both for you and for him. He finally began to realize, bit by bit, that the power dynamics that once ruled him, where fear and insecurity dominated his life, were transforming. Deep down, he knew he could no longer rely on his emotional vulnerability to manipulate his presence. He would have to confront his own fears, just as you had, and learn that true strength doesn't come from needing others, but from the ability to accept and love oneself without depending on anyone. Thus, the relationship between you, which had once been rooted in insecurity,